The chicken slipped from Mr. Nelson's hands and hit the ground with a dull thud. He froze. Footsteps stopped behind him. "Nelson?" His heart slammed against his ribs. He didn't turn. He didn't breathe. The night air around the company store felt tight, like it was pressing him flat. "Nelson, I ask you a question." Slowly, he turned. Mr. Wilson stood there, arms folded, eyes narrowed, a half smile forming like he had just discovered treasure. I was just, Nelson began, then stopped. The lie died in his mouth. The chicken lay between them, its legs tied, feathers shaking slightly. Wilson bent down, picked it up, weighed it in his hand. "Company property," he said calmly. "You know what the CEO does to thieves." Nelson's knees weakened. "Please," he whispered, "I made a mistake. My children haven't eaten meat in months, just this once." Wilson studied him, silent for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Relax, I'm not a monster." Nelson exhaled in relief. Thank you, sir." "But," Wilson added, lifting a finger, "you owe me." The words settled between them like a contract written in blood. From that night on, Nelson slept with one eye open. The first demand came 3 days later. "Nelson," Wilson said during shift change, tossing his locker key on the bench, "I won't make it tomorrow. You'll cover for me." "That's my off day," Nelson replied, surprised. Wilson leans closer. "Do you want me to remind the CEO about the chicken?" Nelson swallowed. "I'll come." The second demand came the next week, then the next. Sundays disappeared. Holidays vanished. Whenever Nelson tried to rest, Wilson's shadow appeared. "You're a good man, Nelson," Wilson would say casually. "Loyal." Loyalty, Nelson learned, was another word for fear. Weeks passed. Nelson's face grew thinner. His hands trembled at work. When coworkers asked why he was always around, he smiled weakly. "I just like working," he lied. One evening, after a double shift, Nelson collapsed on a bench outside the factory. His phone buzzed, a message from his wife. The children asked why you didn't come home again. He stared at the screen, then shut his eyes. The next morning, Wilson arrived late, whistling. "You look terrible. Working too hard?" Nelson's voice cracked. "Please, just this weekend. Let me rest." Wilson's smile vanished. "Careful," he said quietly. "I can forget things, or I can remember them." Nelson nodded. "I understand." No, he didn't. Not until the day Wilson laughed while Nelson nearly fainted on the production floor. "Get up," Wilson whispered. "You're embarrassing me." Something shifted inside Nelson then, a small, dangerous thought. This will never end. That night, Nelson stood outside the CEO's office long after everyone had gone home. His hand hovered over the door. "If I go in," he murmured to himself, "everything changes." He knocked. The CEO looked up. "Yes?" Nelson stepped forward, voice shaking. "Sir, I stole a chicken." Silence. The CEO leaned back, eyes unreadable. "Go on?" Nelson told everything, the theft, the fear, the blackmail, the off days, the exhaustion. When he finished, he bowed his head. "I accept whatever punishment you give me." The CEO studied him for a long moment, then spoke softly. "Why didn't you come sooner?" "I was afraid." The CEO nodded. "Fear makes prisoners of good men." He sighed. "You are forgiven. Don't let this happen again." Nelson felt something break loose inside him. Tears blurred his vision. "Thank you, sir." "Go home, rest," the CEO said. Nelson walked out lighter than he had in months. 2 days later, Wilson cornered him near the lockers. "You didn't cover my shift," Wilson snapped. "I won't anymore." Nelson looked at him, steadily. "I'm done." Wilson's eyes hardened. "You want me to talk to the CEO?" Nelson met his gaze, calm now. "I am free from chicken." If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what you think will happen to Mr. Wilson next. Wilson stepped back, anger rising. "You think this is over?" Nelson didn't answer. He walked away. And for the first time, Wilson felt fear. Wilson stood there long after Nelson walked away, his mind racing. He clenched his fists, then laughed sharply to himself. "He's bluffing," he muttered. "He wouldn't dare." But the laugh didn't feel convincing. The next morning, Wilson arrived early, scanning the compound for Nelson. He found him at his workstation, calm, focused, moving with a steadiness Wilson had never seen before. "You think you're smart," Wilson said, leaning close. "You think one conversation makes you clean." Nelson didn't stop working. "I told the truth, that's all." Wilson's jaw tightened. "You embarrassed me." "You embarrassed yourself," Nelson replied quietly. That single sentence cut deeper than any threat. Wilson walked away, rage boiling. By midday, he was already plotting. If fear no longer worked, he would use authority, or at least pretend he had it. That afternoon, he went straight to the CEO's office. "Sir," Wilson began, forcing concern into his voice, "I need to report a serious matter." The CEO looked up. "About what?" Wilson hesitated. "Mr. Nelson, he stole company property." The CEO leaned back, eyes narrowing slightly. "I know." Wilson blinked. You know?" "Yes," the CEO said calmly. "He came to me himself." Wilson's mouth went dry. "But sir—" "And you," the CEO interrupted, his tone sharpening, "failed to come to me, but instead chose to exploit the situation." Wilson's heart dropped. "I don't know what he told you," Wilson stammered, "but—" "He told me everything," the CEO said. "Every off day, every threat." The room felt smaller. Wilson suddenly couldn't breathe properly. "Leave my office," the CEO said. "We'll talk later." Wilson stumbled out, sweat soaking his shirt. By evening, the rumor had already begun to spread. Workers whispered. Eyes followed Wilson as he walked. For the first time, he felt exposed. Nelson sat alone during break, sipping water. A coworker approached him cautiously. "Is it true?" the man asked. "You stood up to Wilson?" Nelson nodded. "I stood up to fear." The man smiled slowly. Respect. That night, Wilson didn't sleep. He replayed every moment, every threat he had ever made. He realized something terrifying. Once fear is gone, power disappears with it. The next day, Wilson tried a different approach. "Nelson," he said softly, almost friendly, "let's not destroy each other. We can fix this." Nelson looked at him. "There's nothing to fix." "You think the CEO will always protect you," Wilson whispered. "People forget." "Maybe," Nelson replied, "but I won't forget who I became when I stayed silent." Wilson's face darkened. "You're making a mistake." "No, I corrected one." By the end of the week, Wilson was called in again. This time, he didn't come back smiling. He avoided Nelson, avoided everyone. The arrogance that once defined him was gone, replaced with nervous glances and stiff movements. During lunch one day, Wilson overheard two junior staff talking. "He used him," one said, "all because of a chicken." The other shook his head. "That's worse than stealing." Wilson dropped his food tray and walked out. That evening, Nelson sat with his family for dinner. The children laughed. His wife watched him closely. "You look lighter," she said. "I am," Nelson replied. "I told the truth." She squeezed his hand. "I'm proud of you." Back at work, the CEO announced a staff meeting. "I want to remind everyone," he said, "that integrity is not proven when no one is watching, but when you are afraid." His eyes briefly met Wilson's. After the meeting, Wilson approached Nelson one last time. "You ruined me," Wilson hissed. "No, I freed myself." Wilson turned away, shoulders slumped. If this story is teaching you something powerful about fear, truth, and freedom, tap the like button and share it. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to life. But the story wasn't over yet, because fear, once cornered, often strikes back. Wilson didn't strike immediately. He waited. That was the dangerous part. For days, he kept his head down, said little, nodded at instructions, avoided eye contact. To anyone watching, he looked defeated. But inside him, something dark was hardening. Nelson noticed the change. Freedom felt good, but it also felt fragile. He moved carefully now, choosing his words, doing his work quietly. He knew men like Wilson didn't let go easily. One afternoon, as Nelson was cleaning up his station, a supervisor called out his name. "Nelson, the CEO wants to see you." His stomach tightened. He wiped his hands and followed. Inside the office, the CEO gestured for him to sit. "You've been doing well," he said. "No issues since we last spoke?" Nelson hesitated, then shook his head. "No, sir." The CEO studied him. "If anything changes, you come to me immediately. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." As Nelson stood to leave, the CEO added, "Courage is not a one-time act. Sometimes you have to choose it again." Nelson nodded slowly. He didn't know how soon he would need those words. The next morning, chaos erupted. A shout rang out from the store section. Workers gathered. Someone had reported missing supplies. Inventory records were pulled. Names were mentioned. Nelson's name came up. Wilson stood at the back, arms folded, eyes sharp. He's been acting strange ever since he got close to the CEO. Nelson felt the room tilt. "That's not true," he said. The supervisor frowned. "We'll investigate." By lunch, whispers followed Nelson again, but this time they carried suspicion. That evening, Wilson finally approached him, voice low. "I warned you, people forget forgiveness, but they remember thieves." Nelson's chest burned. "You set me up." Wilson smiled thinly. "Prove it." For the first time since his confession, fear knocked again. Nelson went home restless. His wife noticed immediately. "What's wrong?" she asked. "They're accusing me again," he said quietly. She touched his arm. "Did you do anything wrong?" "No." "Then don't run," she said. "You already learned that lesson." The next day, the CEO ordered a full review. Records, cameras, logs. Wilson grew tense as hours passed. By afternoon, the truth surfaced. The missing supplies had been taken under Wilson's access code. The room went silent. Wilson stammered. "There must be a mistake." The CEO looked at him coldly. "There is. You." Wilson turned toward Nelson, eyes wild. "You think you're better than me?" Nelson stood. His voice was steady. "No, I think I'm honest now." The CEO dismissed everyone except Wilson. Nelson walked out, heart pounding, unsure what would happen next. Minutes later, Wilson was escorted out of the building. The news spread fast. That evening, Nelson sat alone, breathing deeply, trying to process everything. A co-worker sat beside him. "You know," the man said, "if you hadn't spoken up, he'd still be using you." Nelson nodded, "And I'd still be afraid." If this story is keeping you glued, make sure you're subscribed because stories like this remind us that truth always finds a way out. The next morning, the CEO called another meeting. "Mr. Wilson is no longer with this company," he announced. "Let this be a lesson. Exploiting another person's fear is a greater crime than stealing." Eyes turned to Nelson, not with suspicion now, but respect. After work, Nelson walked home slowly. The sun was setting. He felt tired, but it was a good tired, the kind that comes from standing upright. His phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. "You think you won." Nelson stopped walking. This isn't over. He stared at the screen, then deleted the message. "No," he said aloud. "It is." He continued walking. Nelson didn't reply to the message. That was the final lesson fear had taught him. Some voices only survive when you answered them. The days that followed were strangely quiet. No sudden accusations, no whispers trailing behind him, no shadow hovering over his brakes. Wilson's absence was loud in itself. The space he once occupied felt cleaner, lighter, as if the air had been scrubbed. One afternoon, the CEO called Nelson in again. "Sit," he said. Nelson obeyed, his back straight, his hands steady. "I want you to understand something," the CEO began. "What you did changed more than you know." Nelson frowned slightly. "Sir?" "People saw you choose truth over comfort," the CEO said. "That matters in a place like this." He paused, then added, "I won't pretend your mistake never happened, but your honesty corrected it. That is rare." Nelson nodded, emotion tightening his throat. "Thank you for giving me that chance." The CEO smiled faintly. "Don't thank me. Thank the courage you finally listened to." As Nelson left the office, he passed the notice board. Wilson's name had been removed, just an empty space where authority had once been abused. That evening, Nelson sat with his children as they did their homework. One of them looked up suddenly. "Daddy," the boy asked, "what's courage?" Nelson thought for a moment. "It's telling the truth even when you're scared of what you might lose." The boy nodded, satisfied, and went back to writing. Nelson leaned back and exhaled. For the first time in a long while, his chest didn't feel tight. At work, small things began to change. Supervisors treated him differently. Co-workers asked his opinion, not because he was special, but because he had proven something. One morning, a new staff member whispered to him, "They say you stood up to Wilson." Nelson shook his head. "No, I stood up to myself." Weeks passed. Life settled into a steady rhythm. The memory of the chicken felt distant now, not erased, but transformed. It no longer defined him. It reminded him. One afternoon, as Nelson was preparing to leave, the security guard called out, "Someone's asking for you." Nelson turned. Wilson stood outside the gate. He looked smaller, thinner. His confidence had collapsed into his shoulders. For a moment, neither spoke. Finally, Wilson broke the silence. "I lost everything." Nelson studied him. "You didn't lose it," he said calmly. "You spent it." Wilson's eyes filled with anger, then something else, regret. "You think you're better than me now?" Wilson snapped. Nelson shook his head. "No, I just stopped being afraid." Wilson scoffed, then laughed bitterly. "That chicken ruined everything." "No," Nelson said gently. "What you did with it did." Wilson said nothing. He turned and walked away, shoulders slumped, swallowed by the road. Nelson watched him go, feeling no triumph, but only clarity. That night, Nelson lay awake, thinking, not about Wilson, not about the chicken, but about how close he had come to losing himself. Fear had promised protection. Silence had promised safety. Both had lied. Truth had been expensive, but it paid in freedom. The next morning, Nelson arrived early, and as he worked, the CEO passed by and stopped. "Nelson, I hope you know, this company needs people who speak up." Nelson smiled. "I know now." The CEO nodded and moved on. As the day ended, Nelson stepped outside, the sun low on the horizon. He stood there for a moment, breathing in the air, feeling present. One small mistake had almost defined his life. One honest confession had rewritten it, and one simple sentence had broken a chain. I am free from chicken. If this story moved you, challenged you, or reminded you of something real, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel for more powerful moral stories like this one, and comment below. What would you have done in Nelson's position? Stay silent or speak up? Because sometimes the greatest theft isn't what is taken from a store, it's what fear steals from a person's soul.